I want to talk about publicly owned property right quick, and it's so relevant right now with all we have going on with our energy situation with these federally owned lands. And you know, the problem is that the federal government owns places like ANWR and the coastal regions, and places in North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah. They own all these places, and so you have this tug of war between what the public thinks should be done with their land. And so you have this bitter struggle. Now let's put aside for a second the fact that everything they're saying about ANWR is wrong. The elk and the caribou and all this stuff, they're not threatened by the places that they want to drill. In fact, you can go on the internet and find pictures of wildlife near Prudhoe Bay, which is a huge oil field near where they're wanting to drill there in ANWR. And you can see the elk and the caribou actually grazing and roaming over the very land right next to the structures that the oil companies have built to bring this stuff out of the ground. You can see pictures of a bear walking on top of the pipeline that's used to distribute this stuff, like a squirrel runs across the top of an electrical wire. I mean, he's walking on top of it like it's nothing. He's enjoying himself, having a good time. There's, all this wildlife has increased since they put that over there, because the operations there warm the ground temperature by a couple of degrees, actually making it easier for the livestock and the wildlife there to survive the cold and hard and bitter winters. And so the population of these species they talk about that are going to be threatened, supposedly, has actually boomed in a very similar situation in Prudhoe Bay, which is not too far from where they want to drill in ANWR. Of course, Prudhoe Bay is the biggest domestic oil field, I believe, in the United States, and provides something like 20% of the domestic supply. Uh, but let's put all that aside for a second and talk about the inherent problem you have with federally owned lands. Anything that's public, the entire population feels like they have a claim upon it, right? Um, Very popular. I am. Um, so let's think about publicly owned things. Think about your public school. Think about the bitter debates that go on between atheists and Christians about things like evolution or creationism. Think about parents' bitter debates over sex ed, over abstinence, or safe sex being taught. Think about these bitter debates over the public schools. Why is it so bitter? Why is there such rancor concerning these issues? Because you're forced to put your money in here to support this thing. And then so you want something that reflects what you would want that school to be. Yet you have all these different competing interests. And some type of vote by the majority is going to determine it. So everything is a all or none proposition. You either are going to teach evolution or you're not going to teach evolution. You either are going to allow creationism or you're not going to allow creationism. Because everybody owns it, there's this constant tug of war about who gets to say what's done with it or how it's conducted. Whereas if you allow people, and this is not a video on public schools, but it's just an example, you allow people to take that same money and go to the school of their choice, they would seek out and they would find schools that matched with what they wanted their child to be taught. And there would be no reason. There would be no reason for parents to argue and fuss and fight over what's being taught in schools. People would just pop up and say, this is the type of curriculum I provide for my students in this school. And people would naturally flock to the places uh, that exemplified what they believed was a good education for their child. So everybody would be happy where they were at. Now, you may have a few people that would like to go somewhere that doesn't line up with what they believe and then try to change it, but really it would be nonsensical. So how do you know what you would like your child to be taught? How do people know what to provide your child? How do they know what should actually wind up being done with your child's education? Because you express that through your choice and through your money, where you put your money. The same thing would happen with public lands. We have this a great piece of land up there that has many different uses, many different possibilities. It could be a national wildlife or a wildlife reserve. It could be a park. It could be hunting grounds. It could be um, an oil field. It could be a million different things. But because it's federally owned and it's owned by everybody, it's going to be one thing. It's going to be one thing or the other. And how is it determined what that one thing is going to be? It's this pulling and this rancor and this bitterness between the competing interests. So how would you solve it? In a free market, just like in schools, people would be free to do with their own land what they please. And so by your money, people would express what they want to be done with it. The overall market, the general market, would determine what was done with that land. Now the oil companies are only interested in a portion of it. Or they may be interested in exploring all of it. They may not actually wind up drilling on all of it. But I know specifically they're interested in one portion for drilling. What would happen under a private land system, which should, every piece of land in the United States should be private. There's no reason the United States government should own 30% of the land in this country. These competing interests would do that. They would compete for the rights to this land. If the environmentalists really want ANWR to be for a wildlife reserve as bad as they say they do, they would pipe up with their money. They would buy that money. And if there was a demand for that to be a wildlife reserve, they would own that money. They would own that land, rather, and people would come and they would pay their money to view the beautiful wildlife. There would be incentives. There would be profit to be made by the general public patronizing that wildlife reserve. Maybe having hunters, come to hunt and thin out the population as the animal, population manager saw fit. And it would be a profitable operation if there was enough demand from the general society to justify it being a wildlife reserve. But if, on the other hand, the demand for the oil in that same region could justify that the oil companies pay a much higher price and buy the land, then that's what would happen. And so the general interests of society would be expressed. And what would most likely happen is the oil companies would buy that one little spot, and the environmentalists would buy the other. And both people would get what they want. But now you have this 50-50 proposition where everybody on the environmentalist side gets either 0 or 100% of what they want. And everybody that wants to drill either gets 0 or 100% of what they want. So it's an incredibly bitter, rancorous debate over what's going to be done with ANWR. Why? Because it's federally owned. Publicly owned lands cause bitterness and rancor. Privately owned property allows everybody, through the expression of the general will of the public by the means of the marketplace, to get what they want. And that's what we should want in society. We should want people getting what they want. You would under private lands. You don't under public lands.